I'm like overwhelmed of everything. Any case, the word Slavophilism means a love of Slavs. So if you're like a Francophile, you love things French, right? Okay. Or an Anglophile, you would love things British, let's say. So that's what that word means. Yeah, if you would be a Slavophobism, like a Francophobism, that means you're against it, that you're against the Slav, you're against the French, So, but the philo means that you love it, or you back it, you're in support of the Slavic movement. It's not a movement. I mean, the overall group of people living there, including, let's say, Poles, which is now ruled over in the Pale Settlement, the Russian Empire, that they're all called Slavs. That's how World War One broke out, when that Archduke was assassinated. So then quickly, well, it was in Austria-Hungary then the Germans back Austria-Hungary, and then the Russians, no, we're in support of all the Slavs, so then they joined in England, and then France, whatever. That's how World War One began. All right. I'm going to talk to you today also about Alexander the Third. Remember, his father, Alexander the Second, who had been assassinated in the year 1881. So he comes to power, and he becomes the czar in 1881 to 1894. Now, those are not the dates of his birth and death. He was actually born in the year 1853. Sorry, am I looking at the right? Sorry. He was born in 1845, and I'll explain to you why he died as a relatively young man as we get through it. Okay, so let's just start off with that first paragraph. This gives you a little background information, right? And then we'll go into the particulars of what happened during Alexander the Third's reign, and of course, how it impacted the Jewish people living there in the Pale. The Russian equivalent to resurgent, growing, coming back, nationalism. I told you nationalism throughout the 19th century comes to the fore as a movement. It means that wherever you are geographically situated, that you are loyal to that nation. All right. So again, if you live in France, you become a French nationalist. If you would be in Great Britain, loyal to England. And obviously, if you're, it comes like a little later. The Eastern Europeans always a little later behind the Western Europeans, but then it already caught on in Russia as well, to being very loyal to the Russian Empire and all things Russian. Okay, do you need something? I'm doing the one that starts with Slavophilism. So check and see. If not, I do have an extra here.
I have.
Okay, excellent. All right. So now again, it's this movement, this idea of being totally loyal to the nation in which you geographically live, right? That's called nationalism. It was formulated in the 1840s. We're talking about specifically to the Russian Empire, and it was given its foremost literary expression by this name of the author, Alexis Aksakov, in the years following the humiliating defeat of the Crimean War. So let me just tell you a little bit about the Crimean War. All right, that was from 1853 to 1856. It was actually started because Russia started to try to make inroads into the Ottoman Empire, and then the Western powers got very concerned about this Russian involvement. I mean, they wanted to still prop up the weak man, ruling that entire Ottoman Empire, which was a huge empire. And Russia wanted to move southward and gain more control around that Black Sea area, and then even further south. So then the French and the British and some Italian troops also now will attack Russia. It was a very long and bloody war. In fact, there was actually an 11-month siege just of the city of Sevastopol. and there was this huge battle. Sevastopol is around, the Black Sea area. And it finally ended, with the Treaty of Paris, with the Russian defeat. So just a little bit below, So we're talking about 1850 to 1856. This is at the time period when Alexander II, right, is reigning over the Russian Empire. So it was like an embarrassment to the Russian forces so that they, lost out. And the treaty that ended the war is called the Treaty of Paris. Now, you might know more about this, the Crimean War, actually didn't affect, of course, the US at all, is that it's, you've heard of Florence Nightingale. Yeah. So this is where she started her movement of being a nurse, and a nurse to everybody, whoever is wounded, in battle, nurses, and then this would be eventually lead, Clara Barton, but she's in the 1860s with the Civil War in the United States, and that's when the American Red Cross was founded. And I'm trying to think of, oh yes, and that famous poem, "The Charge of the Light Brigade"? That is from here, the Crimean War. Okay, so now I'm giving you a little bit of a background. Okay. And so towards the end of the war, this Oaxaca, all right, he had a famous phrase, which was, "It is time to go home." In other words, let's send our loyalty just to Russia, not worry about, invading other lands and conquering them. All right. It was time to stop aping the decadent West, stop. Remember, I told you in the Russian court, they should speak French. They didn't speak Russian. Russian was the language of the peasants, But now we're going to be a shift, going to be more loyal to all things Russian. And they think of the West, it's materialism, socialism, and it's, well, in their minds, Roman Catholicism. So that's not totally true. Obviously, it depends where. I mean, parts of Western Europe are Roman Catholic. Poland, is Roman Catholic. Obviously, Italy, France, England's Protestant. So, it's a mixture. And Germany is half and half Catholic, half Protestant. Russia must be herself. All right, just start taking pride in our, if I'm talking as a Russian nationalist, take pride in our own country, and assert itself in the community of nations through our authentic institutions. Now let's take pride in what we have that's authentic only to Russia. All right, her peasant communes. Oh, that's hard at this point. This is before the serfs were free. Making it sound very beautiful pastoral existence. Her glorious Orthodox Church, big emphasis on the Russian Orthodox Church. In 1871, Nikolai Danilevsky elaborated upon this doctrine in a volume that he wrote called Russia and Europe. Okay. So these are just giving you like the intellectual underpinnings of the idea, of what Russian nationalism meant. In the last years of Alexander II's reign, as the Tsar grew progressively disenchanted with his earlier liberal ideals. Remember, you can divide his reign like almost in two parts. The first, I would say 8 years, he had liberal tendencies, and actually the Jews were thrilled when he came to power because he abolished a lot of the terrible things that Nicholas I, had introduced. But then, he has a shift and he turns reactionary, all right? Okay, so now he and his advisors became devotees, right, of the new Slavophile doctrine. Okay, so it's sort of it's this concept, this idea of Slavophilism, came to the fore because of the writings of those two people who we just mentioned in the first paragraph. They would write about that, and then the idea caught on among, many of people, even in the ruling party. They systematically stripped it of its democratic trappings, and instead adopted the orthodoxy of Slavic civilization and the uniqueness of Russian autocracy. So this new movement is going to include a turn, right, to the Russian Orthodox Church. You know, this is going to be the prime religion of the country, and it's also going to be praising autocracy, that the power of the czar, you know, the power of the ruler, you know, how beautiful this is, and all its many traffic. You know, the rest of the people are starving, but that, you know, this glorious monarch that they have.
That's when the Jews were leaving.
Well, wait, not quite. We're coming to it in a minute. Not quite. I mean, some are. I told you I have a great grandmother and great grandfather. One came in 1870, one came in 1871. I was actually shocked when I found that out, you know, because most of the Jews, right, we'll talk about, right, with 1881. By the time Alexander III assumed the throne in 1881, Slavophilism was transformed from a uniquely Russian form of nationalism. So first, you know, it was just this beautiful idea and concept of Russia, the glorious nation, but now it became a deliberate rationale for reaction. Okay, and now it's going to become an excuse for why we can put down all movements that could be at all, you know, in their mind, construed as being, you know, anti-Russian. Whatever imagination Alexander III lacked, he was not getting, you know, what happened was he had an older brother, Nicholas, who was destined to be the next czar. So, and he had always looked up to this brother. But when the brother, unfortunately, you know, when Alexander was 20, so I don't know, maybe the brother's 22, 23, he passed away. You know, they all thought he was in good health, but obviously he wasn't. He died. And all of a sudden, there's thrust upon now this younger Alexander, the fact that he is going to be the future czar. So whatever imagination he lacked for implementing his philosophy, it was supplied for him. Okay, now I'm going to say, why did he become the kind of person that he was? Because who was his tutor? It was this man, Constantine, hope I can pronounce his name, Pobedonatsus, all right? Who was, all right, his dates are 1827 to 1907. So boy, he had, you know, he lived a pretty long life.
Yeah.
But he was the ideologue of reactionary nationalism. So not just to be loyal to the country where you find yourself and to glorify its various institutions, but reactionary. In other words, to go backwards, you know, to having very tight control over everything. That brother, by the way, died in the year 1865. So, you know, but his tutor all along was this, whatever this guy is, you know, I can't be, I'll say. And he's the one who influences him with this idea, you know, that the only thing that we have to glorify are institutions native to the Russian Empire and to put down anybody who thinks differently. Okay, Papa Nuts, whatever his name is, Nuts then, served from 1880 to 1905. So here's another reason why he was so powerful. He was the chief procurator of the Holy Synod. What's that? As lay director of the Orthodox Church. All right, so he himself was not a priest. Actually, I believe he was trained in the law. But now he has this very high position within the church as a lay leader. In his earlier years, he had also served, as I mentioned, Alexander's tutor, and he had tremendous influence over his pupil. This kind of reminds me when the next czar, which is Nicholas II, and his wife, remember how they came under the influence of that Rasputin, right? Especially the Tsarina, you know, she was greatly, you know, affected by whatever he told her to do or think or feel. So it's a similar type of relationship. Eventually, Pobedonatsus became the most powerful man in Russia. So yes, there is a czar, but this is the power behind the throne. This is the count. He had little faith in the common people. Meanwhile, the serfs had been officially freed in 1862. All right, this was during the reign of Alexander II. in his more liberal days. He was uncompromising Russian nationalist. We're talking about the Count. And he looked to the autocracy and the clergy as the exclusive source of Russia's leadership. Now, how is this going to impact the Jewish people? We'll come up to that soon, coming up. All right. He also poured hundreds of thousands of rubles into the school system maintained by the church. Now, in his eyes, right, why is he supporting the church so much? Orthodoxy, right, the Russian Orthodoxy Church was the ideal instrument to ensure that the Russian people remained a unified herd, obedient to the arbitrary will of just one man, meaning the Tsar. Right. Okay. I just have here some other notes I had put down for myself, that he had a hatred for democratic reform. He was only in favor of having a monarch at the head, of the government, and should be a very strong monarch. He believed in the principle of divinity. Remember the divine right of kings. This is even from the medieval times, that the various kings of all the different countries in Western Europe, they thought, well, they were ruling because like God had blessed them to be the king. That's why all power is vested in them. He was, and again, he's very loyal to that church. This was his political ideal, a nation with just one nationality. If you weren't Russian, by birth, you weren't really part of the country. It should be one language. Everybody should be speaking Russian. One religion, that everybody should be Russian Orthodox. And one form of administration, which would mean the Tsar and his whole apparatus. And there was actually the three key parts to his belief system was orthodoxy, meaning Russian Orthodoxy, autocracy, again, where the power is vested in one person, and nationality. And all these things are coming together to be a very powerful force and a belief system in all those who have the power in the Russian Empire. And the first year, as I see how gradually this is going to start affecting the Jewish people. And the first year of Alexander III's reign, Pobonotsov drafted the notorious police constitution, giving arbitrary powers of arrest to the governors of the various provinces. And this is sort of like the beginning of, there always was something called a secret police, but now it's really going to be formulated into something very concrete. Additionally, the judicial and the educational systems were radically revamped in favor of the aristocracy. Censorship was imposed everywhere, both who even alludes, to the idea of reform, of change. And now again, pay attention because this is now affecting the Jewish people, and non-Russian minorities were now subjected to a far-reaching campaign of Russification. So remember when we talked about those yeshivas, right, being founded in the 19th century? Well, all along, even with Nicholas I, which is 19th century, they start trying to superimpose their ideas upon the Jewish institutions of learning, the schools, that they had to revamp their curriculum and had to introduce Russian, had to be the main language of instruction. And then remember with Alexander II already started in his reactionary days, remember with the yeshiva then of Volozhin and how this is when the Tziv is the rabbi there, trying to superimpose, you can only spend so much time learning Torah. You cannot, and the large majority of the day has to be devoted to secular studies. All ethnic groups now saw their school systems drastically restricted, and their religious institutions restaffed with Russian puppets. the use of their native languages. So obviously, like this would be affecting people speaking Yiddish, or obviously some Hebrews mattering. Was forbidden in school and courtroom, and because of the state was so powerful that, and the secret police, so they would come in and observe and to report on what was going on. So it was forbidden right in school, the courtroom, and in any state enterprise. It was now apparent that Slavophilism was to be synonymous with pure Russian nationalism. So obviously it's going to affect the Jewish people living in the Pale South. We're talking about millions of people at this point, close to 5 million people. But it also was affecting anybody who was of German descent, like more the western parts of the Russian Empire. Poles, well, they definitely wanted to clamp down on that. There probably still is this great hatred between the Russians and the Poles. And Sweden, remember Sweden at one point had invaded from the north. This is more in the 18th century. But there was still some Swedish nationals living within that Russian Empire. So now I was going to clamp down on all of them. And most of these are people who are living on the, so to speak, the fringe of the Russian Empire. Now we're going to talk more about the Jewish people and how this is going to affect them as a minority. And remember, when you think about Alexander II, he's the one who started allowing more prominent, wealthier Jews to leave the Pale. Initially, the idea was that they had to be contained just within the Pale, but he started allowing them because if they could contribute, I told you they helped expand the railroad system. They were foremost bankers. So he started, so it appeared, that things were opening up for the Jewish people. Now, the kabobs are going to be put on everything. As a minority, Jews were subject to the same restrictions, maybe even more, right? I mean, Jew hatred proved also to be a useful weapon to the Russian government. So to deflect, remember, the revolutionary movement is starting to grow within Russia. That was assassinated, Alexander II. So he wants to deflect, this anger that people have against the Tsar, right, and his government. So now they're going to turn it. It's the Jews' fault, right? The pattern is repeated constantly. All right. So and nowadays with this Palestinian movement, same thing. All right, the Tsarist administration now borrowed from the rightist techniques of Central Europe and stigmatized liberalism as the instrument of the Jews. So as if all revolutionaries are Jews, this is not true, but there were a number of Jews in that revolutionary movement. There's no question about it. The time had come for the Jews to be cordoned off even further from Russian life and to be identified as the source of all Russian ills. We're always the scapegoat. We're always there. I always found it interesting when I was learning this time period of history and into the 20th century. Either we were accused on one hand of being, the revolutionaries, and the other hand we're accused of being the capitalists. Okay, so which is it?
Whatever you like.
Exactly, right. Here's a person, not the Leo Tolstoy, the famous novelist, but Count Dmitry Tolstoy, who was the Minister of the Interior, and Wenzel von Flave, I don't know, chief of the secret police, were Jew haters of long standing. So it's not like all of a sudden they turned against the Jews. They never liked the Jews. Right. They emphasized the disproportionately large role played by the Jews in the revolutionary movement. And I'll tell you, it was the truth. It was, actually, some of the people who had been influenced by the Haskalah, some of those people would have eventually become revolutionaries. They subsidized the influential conservative and nationalist press in its persistent and insidious campaign of Jew baiting. So for those people who were literate, right, and they would read the Russian newspapers, it was all filled with this vitriol, this hatred, of the Jew and the blaming of the Jew. Now, when Alexander II was assassinated in 1881, the excuse that they're giving that it's a Jewish cabal, against the Tsar, and against the Russian Empire, because there was like a group of, I can't remember, maybe 7 or 9 people who were specifically responsible for the assassination, and one of them happened to have been a Jewish woman, all right, but the rest were not Jews. Okay, the latent prejudices of the Russian people. So we know that they were always anti-Jewish, we stood out, we were different, was now strenuously and artificially fanned into life. Because the Russian state was structured on Byzantine lines, meaning that it was pretty archaic in its structure, the bureaucracy was in a position to condone anti-Jewish attacks without compromising its authority or prestige. So in other words, they're going to now blame the Jews for everything, and because the general population in general was anti-Semitic, now this is just further reason why we should go out there and murder Jews. The government instantly exploited the fact that Alexander II had been killed by a revolutionary's bomb, and then a Jewess, I just said that, had been involved in the assassination plot. Shortly after Alexander II's funeral, the press began to hint darkly at a secret Jewish conspiracy against the motherland. And this will eventually, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, that's actually a Russian document. You did not know that. And with the Russians, and it came out, I think, around the year 1905. When we get closer to that time, I'll elaborate on it. But I look how that's still around. It's still
it's still around.
Yes, yeah, they're still, in the Arab. I remember reading. You could go even, let's say, in Cairo, you could go to a bookstore, and it's there. It's all translated, into Arabic. So they're all reading it. And people also now, and the newspapers, we're not going to incite the people. Oh, it's the Jews' fault, blah blah blah. And so again, it was a means to deflect the anger of the people towards the Tsar and his repressive policies, to now blame everything that's bad is because of the Jews. Okay. Rumors were circulated, later authenticated, of police collusion in the preparation of anti-Jewish riots. So now those riots that are what we call pogroms that are going to break out, they were really incited by the government. Again, you're taking advantage of the fact that the populace is anti-Semitic. They don't like the Jews in their midst, but now they're going to turn it to their advantage. Don't be angry at us. Oh, it's the Jews. They're the ones who caused all these problems. In the spring and summer of 1881, the worst of Jewish fears were realized as a succession of pogroms, notice it in quotes, spontaneously, right, exploded throughout southern Russia and the Ukraine. And now this is the reason why 2 million Jews from Russia are going to leave, mostly coming to the United States.
2 million. Wow.
Yeah, yes, a huge number. Some will go to then Palestine, but the majority come to the U.S. The Golden Medina, right? They said the streets were paved with gold. Of course, they come to live on the Lower East Side, which was not exactly too glorious. But Kol Hakavod, they picked themselves up by their bootstraps, and they established themselves in America. Of course, too bad most of them, left their religious component of Judaism, but they economically they prosper like unbelievably. So if they started off, let's say, on the Lower East Side, but they would eventually find new, going northward, it would say Manhattan, and of course many went to many other parts of the U.S. as well. So that's where the like the joint distribution activity, well, that's to aid the people in their native lands. The highest, right? That's helped to resettle. And that's why some people ended up in different communities spread out all over the place. Maybe there had been already a few people from a particular town or province already settled. Like my husband's family comes from Rochester, New York. They came here like around 1885. And or in the 1890s, I'm not sure, a lot came in the 1890s. And there were a few landsmen, people from their town in Russia who had been in Rochester had a pretty thriving menswear industry. There's a famous men's suit, Hart. Yes, that's from Rochester. So, it's where a lot of people were employed, but in that, just as on the Lower East Side, a lot of them were employed.
In the garment industry.
Exactly, right. And then, even when later on, I remember in college, if you went to like the area sort of behind where Macy's is, that was the garment district. So it's like in the 30s, right? Those streets. So, it still is, it just
Still is.
yeah. Okay, so now all of a sudden these pogroms are going, all these horrible attacks upon Jewish people. You talk about murder, they raped women. They demolished homes, they looted. Any possible form of destruction you could think of happened.
On the roof.
Hundreds of Jewish homes and shops were gutted and looted. The police remained significantly inactive, like we said, just like in the days like Kristallnacht, 1938, right? Also instigated by the government. And then the police would just kind of stand around as all the shuls were burning throughout Germany. They intervened only when it appeared that damage might spread to non-Jewish establishments. God forbid that should happen. So then they would, come in, arrest people. It was obvious that the disturbances were abetted by the authorities. And unfortunately for the Jewish people living at that time, you can understand now why they all wanted to leave. And at that point, it was no problem coming to the US. The US actually welcomed in immigrants, just as when all the Italians, started immigrating to the United States. So they were happy to have more people to help grow the American industry. But then there were, at this point, some of they would be expelled from place to place, in Russia. Sometimes they would deport people. They were obviously arresting huge numbers of Jews. And beatings became the daily lot of the Jews. Yeah, what a way to live. A shudder of fear passed through the Jewish community of the Pale. Renegade Russian nationalism and the government's determination to identify the revolutionary danger with the Jews placed the very existence of Russian Jewry in question. So then there's the big debate, arose among the Jewish people. Well, should we stay here, or should we leave? So I think, thank God, because we know even more terrible things happened, where the Nazis then rose to power, that thank God that my grandparents did leave when they did and came to America. Grandparents, it says, with memories of the excesses of the mass expulsions of Nicholas I's day, were convinced now that something worse was brewing. And in fact, it was. It was. Definitely things were getting worse.
Right.
On August 22nd, 1881, Alexander III issued an ominous ukazi, like a decree. It dwelt on the abnormal relations between the Jews and the Russian people and ordered an investigation into injurious Jewish economic activities, as if, they're designed, plotted anything to go against Russia. So now the Jew who's, coming up with all kinds of ideas and plans, against the government. The Tsar anticipated a recommendation to destroy the economic basis of Jewish life. Already so many of them were poor, but now he wants to make it even worse for them. Now, again, don't think that they were all poor. That wasn't true. Many of them had migrated already to cities and had established themselves. So there's definitely a larger middle class, but it's still a very large poor, lower class. The Tsar anticipated a recommendation to destroy, the economic basis. Count Ignatia, hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, who was the new Minister of the Interior. It's a very high position in the Russian government, was placed in charge of the Jewish problem. When he failed to obtain a particularly harsh anti-Jewish report from the provincial bureaucrats, so first he wanted to get the heads of the different provinces involved, that they should deal with the Jewish problem in their midst, who he had entrusted with the investigation. He appointed his own central committee for the revision of the Jewish question. It's again makes me think of Hitler, in the Jewish question, or his horrible diabolical plans. October 1881 was a dividing line in Russian Jewish history. A paralyzing list of legal disabilities. I mean, there were laws, passed now against, right? They're dropped on the Jews, which was not lifted until March 1917. What happened in March 1917? The revolution. All right, this is not yet quite the Bolshevik. The Bolshevik Revolution will be in October or November of that year. But first, people will just rise up. At first, it appeared, that there'd be more of a democratic type of institution, but the Bolsheviks were more powerful and they become eventually in charge. But regardless, so the Pale settlement will then officially come to an end in 1917. Russian Jewry was now placed under the sentence of a slow death. I mean, I always find it amazing, how, again, so many of my ancestors and yours, some of you, found their way to America. I mean, how they somehow gathered up the funds. I mean, this wasn't so easy to buy a ticket. That's why sometimes, like a father or an older brother would be the first to come, establish themselves, and as they had saved up some of their earnings, and then would send the money back to Russia so that the rest of the family. I happen to have loved, I don't know what happened to the book. It was a children's book called about the Lekachmacher family. So it was about this family in Russia with 9 children. And right, it talks about the fact that the 3 older brothers come first to the US, establish themselves, right, send the money back home, and then the rest of the family. But it talks about how each of them, how their names change. Very Jewish sounding names to more American, sounding names. And of course, I mean, us as religious Jews, I mean, what happened was so many of them, gave up on their Orthodox practices. I mean, the bulk of these were observant Jews, but they weren't always so well educated. And then they came to America, and in a lot of places, they demanded that they work on Shabbos. And my other Zeta, not so famous, but he came in, I believe, in 1895, and his father had come first. Then he sent for his mother had passed away. Sent for my Zeta. He came over by himself. He was 13 years old. Can you imagine taking this journey? I mean, it could be some other people from the town went with him. I don't know. But still, it was a journey of many weeks. You had to go first by land. You had to get to where the port was. Many of them went to Hamburg, Germany. I actually just started reading a book from the library about the formation of that Hamburg American line, where people would leave from this port. It's up on the North Sea. Then they would go all the way around England and then cross the Atlantic to come to America. That's how some Jews, by the way, ended up in England and Scotland, because they landed. People were speaking English, and they thought, "Oh, we're in America," and they got off the boat.
That's where I was born in Hamburg.
Oh, you were? Oh my gosh, that's amazing. So, well, my grandmother was pregnant with my father when she made this journey, but they didn't come till 1907. That's the other side of the family. In any case, where are we up to? Okay, so we're talking about the ignited guy, all right?
Yeah.
So he was the last paragraph there on that sheet. He was a Slavophile, again, means he loved Slavs, anything dealing with Russians. a reactionary of the most military variety, a man determined to eradicate sedition, right? Opposition, revolution, wherever he found it. He detested all Jews. Was open to receiving bribery if it was of a sufficiently large quantity. Money talks, right? The preamble of the Ignatieff report, so he writes this report, submitted in the spring of 1882, stated bluntly that Alexander II's policy of toleration had failed. The rise of the popular protest in Russia itself proved that new measures would have to be taken against Russian Jewry. The recommendations enacted by the Tsar were considered to be temporary rules. Since the laws were passed on May 3rd, 1882, they came to be known as the May Laws. They were far from temporary, though, and remained in effect with progressive stringency, narrowing and narrowing of everything, in their enforcement until the Russian Revolution, right, in March of 1917. According to the May Laws, no Jew henceforth was permitted to settle in any rural area in Russia. This is a new thing that I learned
They
here.
don't want them.
All of our ancestors were coming from Shtetl,
Yeah.
but already at this date, they're going to be forced to go to live in the cities. Not even within the Pale Settlement. So those Shtetls, this glorious thing, Fiddler on the Roof, that lifestyle came to an end.
Watch them better, probably.
What's that? Yes.
Watch them better.
Right, possibly, right, just to, and also, I mean, they weren't eking out an existence in those little towns, they might have owned some fields and they had animals. And now, though, they're going to be forced into the cities, which are already crowded, and the conditions, so sort of, you'd almost think like a formation of a ghetto, idea. I mean, it wasn't a wall around it. All exits from the crowded cities to the villages were now sealed off. You couldn't go back. You could not go to the countryside to dwell anymore. This legislation was aimed primarily at Jews already living, in the countryside, and at 2/3 of the Pale. So 2/3 were living in those shtetls, in those little towns and villages. The Russian inhabitants of the villages were given the right to expel vicious inhabitants by a special verdict, usually aimed against the Jews. Those who left their villages for a few days could not return. Maybe you were making a trip. Maybe you had a family simcha. No, that's it. You're out. And Jews who had been renting their homes were now denied new leases. Those hovels. There's some of them were living in. Jews moving from village to village looking for work were considered as new settlers and were expelled. In addition, provincial authorities arbitrarily reclassified thousands of small towns as villages, which as rural settlements were thereby closed off for Jews. So even if they
get out.
Right, even though they might have been living in like a little larger settlement, but said, no, out of here. Many Jews managed to stay on in rural areas, again, by recourse to bribery. That always helps. But the great majority were forced out. Jews, by the hundreds of thousands, began to pour from the countryside into the congestion of the cities, which already are crowded. Now it's even worse. Ultimately, the rural Jewish community was all but obliterated. So when I think back to where were, like some of my ancestors coming from, right? They were coming from cities, right? They weren't coming from shtetls, as you would think watching Fiddler on the Roof, it's, they had already, been expelled, so to speak, from the countryside. And most of them are now urban dwellers, and they're poor beyond, the imagination. But imagine why they all went to come to America. It was the land of opportunity. And there for sure, freedom, existed, and, and they could breathe, freely. They could practice whatever amount of religion, they could practice it, there were no restrictions, upon, not to say the people here loved the Jews, but they were accepted. And then they found their way, they were assimilated, into the American life. Okay, so let's just talk about a little bit about the school system. This is how it's going to affect also like the great Volozhin yeshiva. The May laws also targeted the Russian school system, Jewish quotas. Now, this is for anybody who wants to go like to higher education. Jewish quotas were established for the gymnasia, that would be more like a high school, and universities, which slashed the number of accepted applicants. And I know even like in Soviet Russia also, right, there was a quota system for Jews who wanted to go up beyond, getting into certain universities or certain disciplines, certain fields of study. No, it was restricted. Many thousands of talented young Jewish men and women were now forced to travel abroad for their higher education. I always wondered how even the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and Rabbi Soloveitchik, right? They went to like Germany, I think, for they both had PhDs, but they didn't get it living in Russia. Many flocked to Central, that would be Germany, or Austria, and Western European universities, and they later returned with revolutionary and Zionist ideas. So this is when Zionism, the concept, the idea of returning to the land of Israel, settling in Palestine, making the land green again. This is when it's, we saw with Rabbi Kalisher, I mean, he was already from the 1830s, and all along, like the Vilna Gaon, they all had fostered the idea that Jews should return and settle in the land of Israel. But now, a lot of it, the impetus when we study more about French history, will be due because of the Dreyfus case. And then Theodor Herzl, rising to his writings and his calling of the first Zionist, convocation. So it's all going to come out because of these horrible riots. All these other movements, will come to the fore. Okay. All right. Every effort was may also made to dislodge the Jews from the liberal professions and other trades that would have enabled them to live outside the pale. Jewish doctors and lawyers were deprived of their positions. I tell you, Hitler must have studied this, and he came up with his own brilliant ideas. And any Jew living in the Russian interior who sought to enlarge his sphere of economic activity was promptly sent back to the pale. So anybody really who had managed, in the time period, the reign of Alexander II, to get out of the pale, to advance themselves, economically and integrate themselves a bit more into Russian side, back, they had to go back to the pale. Large number of Jewish artisans were expelled from the interior because their trades were removed from the classification of artisanry. But I see that word, I think of arts, like what, arts and crafts? No, they were. They would have been carpenters. Anybody like in the building trades. This was just considered artisanship, in those days. In addition, families whose credentials were found to have the most trivial discrepancies were rooted out. Like your papers weren't exactly right, and forced back into the pale. Often they were given only 24 hours notice to move. Again, this reminds you what happened under the Nazis, how also they would force the people to move to the ghettos. They had hardly any time to gather their possessions, with virtually no opportunity to sell their homes or businesses. Yes, awful. Now I can understand, why my ancestors wanted to leave. I mean, those of you who are my similar thing, or do they ever talk nostalgically about Mother Russia? No, no way. They were so happy to become American, and as American, as possible. So this is interesting. It's also something new I had learned. The May laws reached their climax of brutality with the eviction of the Jewish community of Moscow. They finally, Jews had gotten permission to live, in some of the major cities within Russia, and it's awful for people. In 1891, Alexander III's brother, the Grand Duke Sergei, there were a lot of Grand Dukes, was appointed as the city's governor general in honor of his arrival. An imperial ukase, again, a law was passed, was issued on the first day of Passover, coming up to Pesach, ordering the expulsion of Moscow's 20,000 Jews. You're your manager? Erev Pesach?
That's
Yeah.
my people.
Yeah, what?
Let my people go.
Yes, yeah.
Well, you-
Well, they're a force now. The police spread a solid cordon around the city. In other words, so they circled the city with, troops, conducted their searches during the dead of night, and marched their captives, men, women, and children, in manacles, right? They tied them up to the railway stations. I know, can imagine this all ever Pesach. The famous Moscow synagogue was boarded up, and this synagogue had just been built a short time prior to this. Apparently, it's this very magnificent structure. It was boarded up, and its use forbidden. The mass expulsion of a city's Jewry was repeated with only minor variations in St. Petersburg and in Kharkov. Kharkov, you hear that's in the Ukraine, right? That's in the news. The Pale of the shtetl was fast approaching its end. In its place now appeared the restricted areas of the cities and towns, similar, right? I mentioned this, to the medieval ghettos of Western Europe. The working population fairly equally divided between artisans, again, like people of different skills, and petty, could be tailors, right? That's how so many came and got involved in the tailoring trade in the US, the garment industry. And petty trade has barely managed to keep alive. As a result, the Jews of Russia were steadily driven toward pauperism. By the end of the 19th century, 40% of Russian Jewry were completely dependent on charity. Oh my God, 40% of 5 million people. I mean, that's incredible. In Minsk, fully half of the Jewish population lived on the dole, giving out money, provided by their more fortunate brethren. And of course, in the US, funds would have been, well, at this point, who were the Jews living in America? So some of those Spanish, Portuguese, but a lot of German Jews who came to settle in the 1840s and how they rose. There's some very wealthy family. We'll talk about that if I do it. You were just on American Jewry. So now, they hear what's happening to their poor people living in Russia. So they're sending, money to them. Probably not, that's whatever. They must prepare his own solution. When he stated to a group of Jews who had petitioned him in 1898, this is a very famous phrase of his. What are we going to do with the Jewish problem? 1/3 will die out, 1/3 will leave the country, and 1/3 will be completely dissolved in the surrounding population. So, but just talk some statistics about how many Jews came to America, and over the next, we're talking about up until 1924, when then laws were passed here in the US restricting the number of people who could come in. It was really affected Italians and affected Jews. In the 1880s, 200,000 Russian Jews came to America. In the 1890s, this is where a lot of my other family came, 360,000. And in the 1900s, I did that 1900 to 1910, 800,000 Jews came. And that only gets more and more desperate, as time comes on, because economically things are going to be terrible in Eastern Europe. And that's why they're going to want to get out and found new lives. As hard, I don't know if you've ever seen pictures of what life was like on that Lower East Side, or if you have, there's a museum called the Tenement Museum. Fascinating. If you're in New York and you have a chance to go to, it's on the Lower East Side, and they have set up like what a typical apartment would have looked like. Can you imagine? I mean, like 2 rooms, if you were lucky, the bathroom was down the hall. Sometimes you had to go downstairs, it was out. In the backyard. And they had large families, sometimes to earn more money, they took in boarders. I'll vote how, our but as I say, but they thrived, they worked hard, and they got out of that Lower East Side eventually, and moved up to Washington Heights. Was like, oh.
They moved to.
Yes, my father in 1907 was born there.
Yeah.
You know, at that point, I don't think he went to the hospital so much, so he was born in an apartment, in Harlem. So, you know, I find it endlessly fascinating, this time period, you know, and as we go more into the 20th century, also, I find it incredible what was life like between the two world wars. I think, you know, that's also so interesting. So I want to wish all of you a Chag Kosher V'Sameach. You should have a most beautiful Pesach. I hope some of you were able to get away and go to your children. No, most of us are stuck here, right?
I'm going to Los Angeles
Oh, have a wonderful flight.
for my daughter.
Fantastic. Well, my daughter and her husband and 5 kids are all coming to me.
Very good.
Big fancy houses. I live in a small, you know, townhouse near BRS, but I am happy to have them come. And I must say, my daughter helps with a lot of the cooking. I mean, I can only do like so much and then I sort of collapse. You know, the children-
Another walk, well,
Exactly.
enjoy.
And her 2 big girls, they're 16 and 18. I requested this. I said, you can come, but they need to come a little in advance.
Help, yeah.
Exactly, right.
You don't have to be fancy, you know.
Right. Well, my daughter's gonna have them do some of the baking, so when she comes, she doesn't have to, you know, dry with that. And of course, I mean, she's bringing some of the food, it's a lot cheaper in New York than it is down here in Florida.
Really?
But, oh, yeah, much cheaper. You go to Moishes. There's some other places there, you know, and you get really like I had to buy some of those little cake mixes, you know, that especially Manischewitz makes them. I mean, here in Publix, it was like $6.50 or something. I mean, she can get it for like $3 probably.
Wow,
You
that's
know?
big.
Where does she live, in Brooklyn?
She lives, yeah, in Marine Park,
Oh,
yeah, which is just a little beyond,
I have a family at P33rd, Rabbi Roker.
oh, okay, and she lives on,
Right next to the park.
31st, no, on Avenue R. She's on Avenue R between 31st and 32nd. So,
Very close.
yeah. I know, they go to some place called Tversky's.
Okay.
This place.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess they're all related, anybody.
they're from Milwaukee.
Oh, the families, there are Tversky's in Milwaukee.
Yeah.
But I don't know that they all came from there. I don't really know, but.
That's where my niece lived, and she was very close.
Yeah, well,
With
my granddaughter by marriage, right? What do you call that? Anyways, my grandson's wife comes from Milwaukee and they're also very close
and
to.
all the Milwaukee people
Yeah.
know each other.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
just-
Well, it's not that large a Jewish
Not that
community,
large.
so of course you would know where.
But I asked them, you know, of course.
So, you know, this is the last class for the season, but in Mir Hashem, I'll start up again in November. Mir Hashem, Halavai, should all work out. And I look forward, I actually miss you guys when I, you know, I have like a withdrawal, and I'm not comparing my Jewish history.
Okay.
Yeah.
Back to Shabbos and
Yes, it should be good, just my pleasure. Everybody should stay healthy and well.
Enjoyable.
Thank you, yeah. Thank you. Wait, I think I should turn this off. Let me see.
Speak for yourself.
I have to wait for the, I want to sell the.
Oh.